Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom is a mixed bag. It's a highly atmospheric and creative sequel that is nothing like its predecessor, but it's also weirdly structured, occasionally insulting and annoying. And yet, having watched it over and over throughout my life, I always have a blast and wonder, is this somehow the most fun Indiana Jones has ever been? Well, to answer that, I'm going to analyze it looking at 3 things it does well and 3 things it doesn't do so well. Let me know in the comments what you agree with. Temple of Doom is super divisive, so it should be a fun discussion. But for now, let me discuss Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom's first strength, which is its goofiness. This movie will try anything. Not all of it works, like opening with a musical number, but there's a playful and borderline manic atmosphere that permeates this movie. Indiana Jones is introduced to acting far more roguish than he was portrayed as in Raiders of the Lost Ark.
I suggest you give me what you owe me, or anything goes.
But those darker elements are balanced nicely by just how whimsical and playfully this is all directed. It keeps things light so that I can forgive some dumb elements like Indy inexplicably drinking from a glass that was poured for him by someone who tried to steal from him last night and just tried to steal from him again a minute ago at gunpoint. Or how Indy's partner is killed without noticing it because he's easily distracted by champagne corks. It's unabashedly goofy, but I say that affectionately. The Temple of Doom just goes all out to be fun. The ensuing fight is so over the top with some really silly situations, but Steven Spielberg energetically weaves it all together into something unique. Those parallel and overlapping character beats are sprinkled liberally throughout the Temple of Doom, like in this scene where Willie and Shorty are freaking out for completely different reasons.
Hey, you cheat, Dr. Jones, you cheat.
This scene's already a great example of screwball comedy, but then when the tables get turned and Indy is the one who's freaked out and Willie is the one who's oblivious, it's just a great comic payoff. There's a quirky and energetic rhythm to this movie, which is why the romantic sequence between Willie and Indy is like 7 minutes long, structured like a play, filled with darkly humorous one-sided conversations, and culminates with the punchline of Willie jealous about Indy and a statue. It's so goofy, and that's the thing about the Temple of Doom. Like, this scene is not brilliant by any stretch of the imagination, but it makes me smile more often and in a way that none of the other films do in the series. And no scene exemplifies that more than the Spike Room scene.
Shut up, Willie!
So Willie grates on the nerves for a lot of this movie, which I will discuss in depth later, but this scene works because the characters are in on the joke. Her freaking out without any interaction with the others is exhausting, but Indy and Shorty fighting to survive both physical danger and the mental burden of being around Willie is hilarious. It amplifies the scene. And Indy's face says it all, both when the trap is halted and again when it's restarted. The Temple of Doom embraces that goofy atmosphere, even during its more tense moments. Like a guy has his heart ripped out of his chest in this movie, and then is lowered into a pool of lava while he's still alive and his heart is casually beating in Mola Ram's hand, and then it just bursts into flame. Why? And then what about when Indy turns bad because he drank blood from a desiccated skull? Somehow, this requires more of a suspension of disbelief from me than when Donovan ages instantaneously from drinking from the wrong grail in The Last Crusade. That at least had like some lore that built up to it. Indy turning evil though, that was just introduced by some very convenient exposition in the last scene. Everything feels so random, like using voodoo dolls. It's like Spielberg and George Lucas just threw in every off-the-wall idea they could think of, and surprisingly it works much of the time. Unfortunately, that lack of restraint can be problematic because this movie often veers into being very insulting and tone-deaf, which is weakness number 1. The entire opening in Shanghai is so over the top and slapsticky, and it can be enjoyed, but there's complete tonal whiplash when Indy, Shorty, and Willie arrive in India and encounter a village that's ravaged by drought and worse. And with those heavy themes, it makes things like the opening credits feel out of place and kind of cringeworthy. Opening credits are supposed to get you into the mood for the tone of a movie, but it's hard to reconcile a wacky dance number with the fact that we're going to be introduced to child slavery like 20 minutes later. It's not cohesive at all. And I can accept a little bit of tonal dissonance, but these villagers, they're treated with great empathy during the exposition scenes. Like, all that they've gone through, it's just very dark and depressing, but it's handled respectfully. But then in the very next scene, there's suddenly the props in Willie Scott's stand-up comedy routine. This movie just keeps veering back and forth between tones. Like, even scenes that I like the campfire scene, like, that's such a delightful, humorous, character-based scene. But that's immediately followed by a really dark scene with the altar with the severed fingers, which foreshadows all that's going to happen in the mid portion of the movie. So maybe now would be a good time for the Temple of Doom to stay serious for a bit. But what do we get next?
Chilled monkey brain.
This is the strange thing about the Temple of Doom. It's infamous for being the darkest Indiana Jones movie, but it also feels like Spielberg, Lucas, and the rest of the creative team were not confident in that decision, and they overcompensate with outlandish shock value moments like the dinner sequence, which absolutely derails the Temple of Doom, because this scene is overly long, distracting, unfunny, and ignorant. And I said ignorant and not racist because I think for it to have been racist, it needed to be intentionally, ignorant towards Indians, which I don't think Spielberg or anyone was intentionally doing this. But this scene is absolutely responsible for a lot of misunderstandings of Indian culture, especially back in the 80s and 90s. I mean, growing up, a bunch of kids would ask me, hey man, do you eat monkey brains? Though as a kid, I did not perceive that as a lack of cultural awareness. I perceived that as, oh my god, you watch Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom? That's one of my favorite movies, let's be friends. But even without being intentionally insensitive, the scene just doesn't work because it's too broad with its humor, and the scene just goes on. And it falls flat because nobody else at the table reacts, least of all Indy, who is afraid of snakes. And worst of all, it's a very distracting scene. There's a lot of exposition about the Thuggee cult and a little bit of background on Indy as a character, but no matter how many times I've seen this movie, I find this conversation hard to track because it's so fragmented.
This area, this province, was the center of activity for the Thuggee.
Dr. Jones, you know perfectly well
That this scene kept veering wildly back and forth between tones, and so it structurally made no sense. Yeah, I knew that perfectly well. And that's because the Temple of Doom does this several times. Maybe not to this degree, but it happens later in the movie as well. Only in the Temple of Doom can you have the powerful emotional catharsis of Indy, Shorty, and Willie freeing these children from the slave masters, only to follow it up with this bit of Three Stooges idiocy. And that tone-deaf and erratic vibe to this movie contributes to some bizarre pacing, which is weakness number 2 for the Temple of Doom. Rescuing the children is part of 25 straight minutes of pure action that concludes this movie. And once Indy gets poisoned in the prologue, it's about 13 straight minutes of action until they are safely in India. Temple of Doom is bookended by 38 minutes of action set pieces. So how much action do we get in the remaining 80 minutes? Well, we get this and we get this. And neither of these are action extravaganzas, they're mostly played for laughs. All that to say, the Temple of Doom has no structural balance. Even the darker and more dramatic, compelling moments are mired with pacing issues. Spielberg slows things down to build tension and suspense.
Galima.
But because there's been so little action in the mid portion of the movie, these scenes just naturally drag because it's get on with it. And this is still a shocking and impactful scene when Molaram rips the guy's heart out. I mean, it's the first time I remember my dad ever covering my eyes during a movie, and my parents both banned me from watching the Indiana Jones movies till I turned 9 because of this scene, so it is very memorable for me. But it's not a scene that I look forward to on rewatch because it's so slow, and this goes doubly so for the whole side plot of Indy turning evil. I'm sure some of you find this part entertaining, but it's always felt tangential to me. Everyone knows that Indiana Jones is not going to stay bad. Unfortunately, it's dragged out in the longest scene in the movie, and seeing as it's essentially hitting the exact same beats as the previous sacrifice scene, minus the actual beating heart, Temple of Doom comes to a grinding halt until Shorty burns some sense into Indy. And I do have some questions about this, because Shorty's able to turn Indy and the Maharaja back into good people by burning them with a giant torch. And I get it, it's like a big flame wound, so it's gotta hurt. But why is the actual transformation occurring on an altar surrounded by candles? I mean, those are open flames. Indy kicks some of them over when he's being transformed. What if those flames get on you mid-transformation? Are the cult members like, oh no, they're turning back good. We just used all that Kali Ma blood on them. We gotta give them more Kali Ma blood. That's a waste of perfectly good Kali Ma blood. Is it Kali Ma blood or Kali blood? I don't remember. But regardless, it's so random and it highlights how flimsy this side plot actually is. But even if I don't know the name of this beverage, I do know what this movie's strengths are. And I can safely say once this excursion ends, the action avalanche to end the Temple of Doom is this movie's second strength. The slave rescue, the fight near the rock crusher, the minecart chase, the bridge collapse, everything works. It has its cheesy moments, but it's an incredible mix of elaborate set pieces, iconic shots, and some of John Williams' best music. And with such a focus on action, those unfortunate moments where they try to be overly funny are minimized. Instead, we get more quick-hitting gags like this hilarious callback to Raiders of the Lost Ark, or this bit of dark humor.
I know, lady, we're going for a ride.
We sure are going for a ride, Shorty. The final act of Temple of Doom feels like a direct response to the slower third act of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I gotta shout out the final fight between Molaram and Indy. I'm not the biggest fan of him suddenly knowing the magic words that cause the Shankara stones to burst into flames. That feels like something he pulled out of his ass, just like the "Shut Your Eyes, Marion" from Raiders. But it's so satisfying to see Indy actually having a big fight scene with the big bad guy of the movie. There's a raw physicality to the scene, and combined with how evil Molaram has shown himself to be and how precarious the situation is, it's so effective. And that's true for the entire climax because it's so creative, so claustrophobic, and so riveting that it doesn't give the script a chance to shoot the movie in its own foot. Like, did anyone else notice how quiet Willie Scott is during the climax? Okay, there was that, but mostly she is fairly subdued at the end of the Temple of Doom. For the rest of the movie, though, she is absolutely not subdued. She is my third and most obvious weakness of the Temple of Doom. Now, I don't blindly dislike this character. I think there's legitimately funny things happening when Indy and Shorty react to her, and I think Kate Capshaw does what she can with a terribly written part. But Willie has a combination of obnoxious and grating character traits that are just exhausting. It's so annoying. Like, how does she not notice this? Like, how does that even happen? You would feel a bug crawling in the palm of your hand. Just because it's upside down doesn't mean there's suddenly a bug under there. Oh, I broke a nail. Well, I guess I didn't. Oh, did you think there was going to be a bug there? No, my whole point is there's no way you wouldn't notice that. Like, you know what's in your hand. Something doesn't just suddenly pop. Ah! Oh, it's just a note that says to like and subscribe and comment on this video if you're enjoying it. It really helps the channel. But back to the point at hand, I don't know what they were going for with Willie. George Lucas was going through relationship issues when making this movie, and that combined with trying to have a contrast to Marion from Raiders may have led to Willie just being shrill and obnoxious. But without a character arc of any sort, she just ends up being a perpetual nuisance.
Where's my gun?
I burnt my fingers and I cracked a nail!
And Indy doesn't even seem to like her, which makes the justification for her being on this adventure super flimsy.
I'm allowing you to tag along.
But with all of that said, Willie being in this movie so much, and especially Shorty being in this movie so much, do contribute to strength number 3, which is the group dynamic. Now, that sounds like I'm contradicting myself because I just complained about Willie, but bear with me for a second. Because despite all of its flaws, the Temple of Doom is still goofy fun, and nothing in this movie makes me laugh more than the central trio's interactions. Even when Willie's at her most annoying, Harrison Ford, Kiwi Kwan, and Kate Capshaw all play off of one another effectively.
The biggest trouble with her is the noise.
As I said, it can get to be a bit much, but most of this movie's entertainment factor would be drained without the constant screaming and harping at each other. And it's clearly the relationship between two of the characters where the heart of this movie is. Oh, I can see how that would get confusing. No, it's Indy and Shorty's relationship. And I did like Shorty way more when I was a kid. Nowadays, I don't find him cheesy, but I find him less funny than I used to. There are some legitimately heartwarming and heart-wrenching scenes between Indy and Shorty. The movie doesn't go into any depth with that relationship, but the big brother, little brother vibe and that fierce sense of protectiveness they have for one another is a powerful ingredient.
Indy, what's that?
But more than anything, I feel the group dynamic allows Harrison Ford to make Indiana Jones a more well-rounded character in Temple of Doom. Don't get me wrong, he was great in Raiders, and Marion was a fantastic sidekick, but that was mostly a solitary adventure. If you go back and watch it, you'll see how often Indy is by himself. In Temple of Doom, he's always got someone to play off of, and while some of it is hard to stomach, like his casual misogyny towards Willie, I think Temple of Doom is much clearer than Raiders was about how Indy is making this all up as he goes.
You know how to fly, don't you?
No, do you?
Indy is also a much darker character here. He's more ruthless, selfish, and less altruistic, but that allows for a nice balancing act as over the course of the movie he does change for the better. And the group dynamic brings out the humor as well. This is a much funnier Indiana Jones than the one from Raiders of the Lost Ark, like with this water gag or this incredible bit of Harrison Ford facial acting. And Temple of Doom's group dynamic is flawed, but it does set the stage for the future Indiana Jones movies. And Last Crusade would perfect that dynamic with Sean Connery as Indy's dad. So I gotta make it a strength here for giving us that. But to answer the question I posed at the beginning of whether Temple of Doom is the most fun Indiana Jones movie, I think it's sometimes. Spielberg, Lucas, and the writers throw so much zany crap at the wall that some of it sticks and makes me smile wider than anything else in the series. But then there are so many clunky, cringeworthy, gimmicky, and insulting elements in this movie that overall, it's too hit or miss to be the most fun Indiana Jones movie. So thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe to my channel. All this talk about group dynamics is making me crave that group dynamic, so it would be wonderful if you all joined this community.
What a vivid imagination.